What I'd like to do is just describe a little bit about one aspect of the research that I've been doing at Purdue. Just by way of introduction, I work in a laboratory that's focused on integrating nutrition, exercise, and aging. And we are part of a research consortium that is an NIH-sponsored Clinical and Translational Sciences Institute, as here. I also work very closely with an Ingestive Behavior Research Center and a Center on Aging in the Life course at Purdue. And so much of the work that I will be describing is not only thematically linked to this, but also very wonderfully supported by these organizations. For the CTSI, I happen to be the director of the Clinical Research Unit at Purdue, as well as the director of Bionutrition Services for the entire state of Indiana. Just real briefly, the CTSI in Indiana is actually a statewide consortium. And so we are actually in partnership with Purdue, Indiana University School of Medicine, which is the parent applicant for the grant, Indiana University in Bloomington, as well as Notre Dame University. And so we're literally statewide, which is remarkable for resource purposes. I thought I'd start and just describe, I just put this up just to let you know the breadth and the types of collaborations that my group is wonderfully fortunate enough to participate in. And so I don't have a particular agenda or point to make other than that it takes a real village to make research like we all do take place. And I put this slide together about a week or two ago and specifically just to remind myself as well as describe for all of you just the breadth of different talents and expertise that go into doing translational and human research. And specific to my laboratory, these are sort of the composite themes of my laboratory. If I were to, as I take my list of bibliographies and abstracts and I sort of start to package them into different emphasis areas within my lab, these are the emphasis areas that I come up with. And the most, again, all of them thematically link between nutrition, physical activity and exercise, and aging, but we then use that to branch off into different areas. Some of the ones that I'll be talking about today are physical activity and exercise, body composition, and appetite, as well as a little bit on dietary patterning. So my laboratory, I like to break my research into fundamental questions and then more applied questions. And I was all set the other week to actually give a talk that integrated both the fundamental and the integrated here. And then Doug gave me a call and said, well, you know, we hear a lot about aging, so why don't you tell us about the weight control part? So I will forego much of the data specifically on looking at dietary protein needs and adequacy in older adults, although I will be glad to talk about that. But I'm going to focus more so on the integration of dietary protein, energy restriction-induced weight loss, physical activity, and a focus on body composition and skeletal muscle in particular. Just by way of sort of to set the framework, when you look at the dietary guidelines and the dietary reference intakes, excuse me, for the macronutrients, these are the acceptable macronutrient distribution ranges for carbohydrates, fats, and protein. And two things specific to protein that are readily apparent is one is that there's a wide range of potential intakes that are considered to be acceptable, and that the recommended dietary allowance for all adults, independent of age, independent of body size or gender, is 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight per day. When we look at protein intake across the age spectrum, we can see that protein intakes in both males and in females progressively goes up as someone goes into maturity, and then progressively goes down as someone advances into their senior years. The protein intakes are quantitatively higher in males than females, in large part because of increased energy needs. And that as when we take a look at, while on a quantitative basis older people are eating less, that actually when you look at it as a proportion of their calorie intake, there is remarkable stability across the lifespan of the percentage of calories coming from protein, both in consistency from males and females, but also across the lifespan. What this tells us is that the on a broad scale, that people are really creatures of habit in what they eat, and that protein intakes are remarkably conserved, and that really is what's driving your adequacy or inadequacy of protein is your energy need, and therefore your energy intake. Because even though there is still a percentage over here of folks that are getting an inadequate amount of protein, they're still eating the same things they've eaten, they just are eating less of them. The other thing I'd like to point out is that the 10% and the 35% up at the top, the dashed lines represent, thank you very much, they represent the acceptable macronutrient distribution boundaries. And what it's telling us is that this large area, this large gap, actually can be viewed as a means to increase intake and still have it be acceptable and hopefully healthful for all adults. But it's also a realization that most people don't eat protein intakes up in this range. And so any recommendations to be able to dramatically increase protein intake to 25 or 30 or 35% of calories is going to really be a struggle for people to maintain, because if they are really creatures of habit, it's going to be hard for people to habitually change their eating behaviors. One last thing about eating behaviors is just the recognition that if you start to look at the daily patterns, protein intakes at breakfast, lunch, and dinner, that they are progressively higher. Dr. Patton-Jones and all of you are well aware of this. What I would like to point out, though, is that this patterning is maintained into older ages as well. And that really the reduced protein intake at breakfast, a little bit more at lunch, and then mostly at dinner, is a reflection of actually two things. One is that people eat less calories at the earlier meals, and that the percentage of calories as protein at those meals is less. So ways to increase protein intake at breakfast and lunch could be actually a combination of actually changing the macronutrient intakes at those meals and increasing protein quantity, or just redistributing the calories so that they eat more total amount of food at those eating occasions. But this is just a reminder that when we look at the sources of dietary protein, that both in men and women, about 40% of the protein that we consume are from flesh foods, about 25% are from dairy foods. So in combined, we have about 65% of our protein intakes coming from animal-based proteins, which are very high quality as far as amino acid composition. Now, what I thought I would do is when we think about weight control and body composition, or weight control in general and dietary protein, I thought I would break down my talk into four sections. Describe some of the issues about whether or not higher protein diets happen to be, what their effects are on satiety. These are sort of the things that are often used to promote protein intake for weight control. Thermogenesis, actual body weight changes and weight loss, and then we'll finish with some discussions about body composition responses, including skeletal muscle. So for satiety, very basic question, do higher protein intakes promote satiety, which in theory should help people with their weight control? These are data from my laboratory where we did acute feeding studies in the laboratory. So these are in-house measurements. And over the course of 4 hours, we were measuring appetite. Sorry, this got cut off, but this is actually a hunger scale. And what we did is we brought the folks in. We asked them to rate their hunger. We then fed them a meal, and that meal was either normal protein or high protein, where we kept the fat content of the meal the same, but we manipulated the carbohydrate to protein ratios, and we then tracked their ratings of their perceived hunger throughout the next 4 hours. And you can see that you have an immediate drop followed by a progressive increase, and collectively the area under the curve of the composite responses was less for the high protein meal than for the lower normal protein meal. And that also, the same pattern was also apparent for desire to eat, and actually opposite for a perception of fullness. And these are very typical types of data that you can reproduce in the laboratory to support a satiety types of responses from higher protein intake in a meal. We then were interested to further that single meal response and see whether or not it was reproducible with patterning across the day. And so what we did actually is we fed people different protein intakes, either as a normal protein or as a high protein meals. And we if you look at these different triangles here, what we're doing is the large dark triangles is we were feeding people 3 times a day, so a 3 meal per day pattern, or we were breaking that up and actually eating 6 meals per day. So we were looking at the quantity of protein as well as the patterning or frequency of consumption. And while this looks pretty scattered and skewed, what you can see is that there is a greater oscillations of the solid lines than there is of the squiggle or the dashed lines. The solid lines represent the 3 meal per day pattern. The dashed lines represent the 6 meal per day pattern. However, and you can see up here that when we look at the first eating occasion, second eating occasion, and third eating occasion with the normal protein and the high protein diets, we can see that there was definitely a difference in appetite or hunger responses between the high protein and the normal protein. This happened to be a measure of fullness. And that collectively over the course of the day, that when you ate a high protein diet, that you had greater daily fullness than you did if you ate a normal protein diet. Much to our surprise, though, is that when you take this as a composite area under the curves, the frequency of eating did not matter. Now, keep in mind that this is a reflection of the entirety of the area under these curves. It does not reflect the area under the curves in shorter time frames. So there was still definitely more oscillations in response from the 3 versus 6 meals, but when you take it out over the course of the day, collectively there was no differences based on eating frequency, only protein intake. So that brings you to the question of, well, can high protein diets induce a satiety response? And these are data that are often cited to be able to support the claim or that high protein diets are better. And these are data from 2006, which looked at a low protein diet versus a high protein diet, 10% versus 30% of calories, and they concluded that the high protein diet was more satiating. The thing that's of interest to me, though, is that the real reason for the difference here is not that these values were any higher than here. I mean, the top ceiling of this is about the same. It's that there just wasn't this variability going throughout the group of subjects. And so it really lends itself, while the authors concluded that there was a satiety effect, I question, what's going on here? That is it really an enhanced satiety, or that you're just bringing the rest of these folks up to everybody else? And so we went back into the literature and we started looking, and we really found a divergent responses about protein and whether or not it really is satiety inducing. And one of the things that came out, and this is not a complete description of the literature, but just as for illustrative purposes, that what we found is that many of the studies that had done acute meals, typically in a laboratory setting where all the other extraneous distractions and happenstance of a person's life are taken away or controlled, they show that protein is satiety inducing or increase fullness or decrease hunger. However, when you look in the literature on chronic effects, longer term feedings, most of the data in this actually cannot find an effect of protein. And usually these types of experiments are where people are asked to rate their hunger, rate their fullness while they're going about their daily business. And so if people are interested in doing these types of analyses, I think it's important to realize that setting matters. And that you could argue that this is efficacy and this is effectiveness. And we have to be careful that we don't leapfrog from efficacy into effectiveness in saying that protein is satiety inducing. For thermogenesis, the second question is, do high protein diets increase or promote thermogenesis, which is another of the suggested reasons for why high protein diets may help in weight control? We know that under controlled conditions, that if you give isolated quantities of protein, carbohydrate, and lipid, that protein is the most thermogenic. Typically in experiments, 20 to 30% of the energy contained in the protein meal or beverage or whatever is being provided is ultimately utilized in the processing of and uptake of the protein. Carbohydrates generally 5 to 10, and lipid is actually very low thermogenic. Most of this related to protein, that muscle protein synthesis and turnover is a major contributor to the BMR, and that the energy cost of urea excretion is a main factor in protein's large thermic effect. The question is this what is known in isolation for a given macronutrient against a different macronutrient, is that actually meaningful over the course of a day in a mixed meal that may just have subtle differences in macronutrient intake? This is a very good example of this, where there was a study that where they did a high protein diet, 29% of calories as protein, including striated tissue from pork, versus a vegetarian diet with a lower protein intake. They also measured a person's thermogenesis before or during their basal conditions as well. And as you can see, they measured a variety of different components of energy expenditure, diet-induced thermogenesis, daytime energy expenditure, sleeping, basal metabolic rate, 24-hour spontaneous physical activity, and ultimately 24-hour energy expenditure. And what we're looking for is that indeed, with the higher protein diet, there was about 117 calories more burned throughout the day than on the lower protein diet. Now, that doesn't necessarily sound like a lot, but an additional 117 calories a day if repeated over time has the ability, potential ability to influence energy balance in a demonstrable way. So is this the answer? Well, here's some other studies that looked at shorter times of thermogenesis. Well, 2.5 hours, 1 to 3 hours, and actually 3 days. And they also show a thermic effect of 14 calories an hour higher, increases of 85 calories over 3 hours, 24-hour energy expenditure over about 140. So now we're starting to build a literature that suggests that indeed protein is thermogenically superior to a lower protein diet. However, the question is this sustainable? Can the results from a short-term experiment or an acute experiment actually be reasonably translated into long-term differences in thermogenesis? And one of the examples of how this was attempted was that they looked at the thermic effective feeding response to a high-protein test meal of either being normal protein or low protein, 15% of calories is protein, versus 27%. They looked at this at baseline and after 16 weeks of habituation to those diets. And lo and behold, at week 0 or at baseline, there was a 2% difference in the thermic effect of feeding, consistent with higher protein intake being more thermogenic. However, when they then went and remeasured this at week 16, there was no statistical difference between these measurements. And if you had suggested that the difference in weight loss that occurred in 4 months, that the total energy expenditure and the weight loss did not differ between these subjects at 16 weeks. And so while you would expect that if this was carried on throughout the 16 weeks, you would have had a differential weight loss, that did not occur, and these data actually support that. So we start to wonder, are the data, can we reasonably extrapolate results from acute feeding studies to chronic changes? So let's go on and look at actual weight loss. These are a number of studies that actually have been reported over the years looking at the effects of higher protein diets that have all resulted in increased weight loss in the high protein group versus the normal protein group. And you can see that the durations range from about 2.5 months all the way out to about 6 months of time. And there's a variety of different interventions, but collectively all of these studies show that weight loss as the primary outcome is superior when the high protein diet was consumed over the normal protein diet. Now, given what I showed before, that 2 of the main effects, the thermogenesis and the appetitive responses over time, there's not really a strong literature to suggest that what we measure in the short term actually recurs. You start to question whether or not there's other factors that may have an impact on this differential weight change over time. This is a very sort of classic dramatic example of what I'm talking about. A high protein diet, normal protein diet over the course of 12 weeks and then carried out for an additional 12 weeks for a total of 24 weeks. And you can see that the folks on the high protein diet lost dramatically more weight than the people on the normal protein diet. And this type of a study is often used as a rationale for high protein intakes. However, if we look more collectively at the literature, what we find is that you can come up with any answer that you would like. This is a laundry list of experiments. This is not an exclusive or comprehensive list, but you can see that everybody that did a study of looking at the effects of protein quantity on weight loss hypothesized greater weight loss in the high protein group. Yet, when you look at the results, there ranges from apparently successful to unsuccessful to neutral. And you can go down, and most of these were, again, in that sort of 6 to 20 week change. So I bring this up really just to caution everybody against just accepting that protein really is the magic bullet, as it were, for enhanced weight loss. There may be other reasons why we would like to have a higher protein diet, but if you think about it under these conditions, if people are really eating the same amount of calories or being prescribed the same number of calories, but they're losing weight, given the subtle differences in thermogenesis, what you're really looking at is an issue of dietary compliance. And these studies that show greater weight loss may actually be a reflection that somehow their appetite and ultimately their ingestive behavior was being changed. But if under conditions of strict dietary control, there's not really a lot of support that calorie for calorie having higher protein intakes will actually augment weight loss during energy restriction. This is another example of that. These are where I was showing, what I would like to show here is that, again, lower versus higher protein diet. What I did here is these are longer term studies, typically out to 12 to 24 months. And I note here when there was a significant difference between groups, between normal protein and high protein. And you can see, for example, this group showed that there was a significant difference in weight loss at 6 months, but by the time you got out to 12 months and 24 months, there was no difference. Here they're showing that this particular study did show sustainability of it. Here it actually showed that there was no difference at 6, 12, or 24. Most of the data actually suggests that over a long period of time, meaning a year or so or more, that the macronutrient distribution of the diets did not impact on weight loss. So then let's talk about body composition. And the question is, does a higher protein intake during a period of energy restriction and diet-induced weight loss have a favorable effect on lean body mass? And I just wanted to introduce just briefly, for those of you who like to get into the molecular parts of this, these are results from a study that we did looking at having younger and older men consume different amounts of protein, either a low protein, a medium protein, and a high protein. And in this case, the low protein was 0.5 grams per kilogram body weight, so less than the RDA. This was 0.75, or right around the RDA for protein, and this was 1 gram per kilogram body weight. And what we did is we took muscle biopsy samples, we looked at the genomic profile. So we did microarrays to look literally at about 16,000 different transcripts. And we then did some cluster analysis to look at different groupings or clusterings of transcripts that are involved in certain metabolic processes. So in this case, this was cluster 1. There were 159 transcripts that were involved with ubiquitin-dependent protein catabolism in some way, protein breakdown. And what we observed that, this is a 30,000 foot view. This is not on a specific transcript or gene basis. But what we observed is that the expression profile for this clustering that's associated with protein catabolism went up when you had an inadequate amount of protein, and that there was really no difference in it by the time you got to around the RDA or 25% higher than the RDA. I really wish we had data or protein intakes that went out even higher, but that was not the nature of the experiment at the time. In contrast, we see that when you look at the transcripts that are involved with anabolic responses and tissue development and muscle anabolism, that these transcripts stay relatively low until we get to above the RDA. So these, collectively they show that if you don't eat enough protein, you induce a catabolic state, and that it's not until you're actually above the RDA that you're promoting an anabolic state, at least from this 30,000 mile or 30,000 foot vantage point. So does protein intake influence body composition changes with weight loss? These are data from Denise Houston and colleagues that were published about 4 years ago that have from the Health ABC study, and they very clearly describe sort of a titration of response from the lowest protein intake to the highest protein intake among several thousand older individuals. They were measured 3 years apart in time, And you can see that the median intake of protein for the lowest quintile was less than the RDA, which is 0.8. So this is clearly an inadequate amount of protein. About 11.2% of their calories from protein, and progressively higher. The average protein intake, the median, the middle quintile, is right around the RDA, and then progressively higher to where the highest 20% of this group of older individuals was at about 18% of calories and about 1.1 grams per kilo. What they reported, and I quote from the abstract summary, participants in the highest quintile of protein intake lost 40% less lean mass and appendicular lean mass, both measured by DEXA analysis, than did those in the lowest quintile of protein intake. And so this actually got a lot of people very interested that further confirmation with a functional or phenotypic outcome, I should say, that more protein is better than having less. However, they also published this graph. And this graph is taking the same data with the same quintiles, but partitioning the participants into people that were losing weight during that period of time, were weight stable during that period of time, which was the bulk of the individuals, or actually gaining some weight. And what you see, let's just focus right here first. For people that were weight stable, they were all losing appendicular lean mass, which could be a surrogate for skeletal muscle mass, because appendicular lean mass is basically the lean tissue in your arms and your legs. So it could be but what you see is that while it was going down in everybody, the amount of protein that they consumed had no influence on this change. Where the change was occurring, or the differential responses, were in the people that were actually losing weight. They lost more lean tissue than if you were weight stable, and if you were losing, if you had an inadequate amount of protein in your diet, you lost more than if you otherwise would have. And lastly, with weight gainers, it was the group that ate the highest quintile that had the largest actual increase in skeletal muscle lean mass. So we go back, if we go back to knowing that data, and we go back to this conclusion, I think it's left to each of us to interpret it as we see fit about whether or not these data that show this titration response and the conclusion that protein intake is bad for, or inadequate protein intake is bad for lean tissue mass over time, is actually the complete and completely accurate take-home message when we look and see that it had no influence absent of changes in body weight. So these are the guidelines for weight loss of older people from the 2005 guidelines from put out by Valeriel and his and colleagues as part of a position paper. They suggest a moderate energy restriction for older people, 500 to 700 calories per day energy deficit, and protein intakes of about 25% higher than the RDA currently, regular exercise, and behavior modification. It is important to notice that they include both aerobic and resistance exercise in these recommendations. So what is the impact of energy balance on nitrogen balance and the risk for losing nitrogen as you get, are you at increased risk for losing nitrogen from your body if you're in energy deficit? And so to answer this question, we actually go back from data, classic studies from Callaway and Spector back in 1954 and some others from back in the 80s, as well as as far back as into the 50s. And we just look at the nitrogen balance in versus nitrogen intake. So going from 0 to 16, this is the number of grams per day of nitrogen intake Remember that to go from nitrogen to protein, you multiply by 6.25 on average. So if we were sort of in this range here, we're actually talking about 40 to 45, maybe 50 grams of protein per day. And what you can see very clearly is that not only does the quantity of protein determine your nitrogen balance, but also the energy state that you're in. And the more negative your energy state, reflected here by inadequate energy for weight maintenance, that you have a lower nitrogen balance. And so that would suggest that if we are having people purposefully lose weight, that would actually put a stress on their nitrogen balance and actually promote loss of nitrogen from their body. This is just another example looking at the same thing, nitrogen balance over nitrogen intake, and then looking at how many calories per day people have eaten. So it's not a new concept, is my point, that this has been around for a long time. This is another way of looking at it, and just showing again that if you look at the number of calories that people are consuming, going from all the way from a very low intake, which may be typical of an elderly person, to an extremely high intake, which may be reflective of a young endurance athlete, for example, that it's both, your nitrogen balance is determined both on the quantity of protein or nitrogen that you consume, with it going up as you eat more, but also going up and down this way as a reflection of how many calories you consume. Now, when we look at body composition in young individuals with weight loss, this is a very typical pattern. Weight loss of, proverbially, or so theoretically, if this was a 500 calorie a day energy deficit, and we are seeing that they lose over 12 weeks about 12 pounds of, sorry for not making that black, it's 5.45 kilos, so about 12 pounds. And that of that weight, it can be partitioned into about 75% as fat mass, and about 25% of what you lose is lean body mass. If you then further partition the fat-free mass into total body water, protein mass, and mineral mass, you can see that what you're really losing predominantly when you lose lean tissue mass is water, not necessarily with less protein and very modest amounts of mineral. So we wanted to know whether or not those observations which were made in young individuals also applied to older individuals. And so Eileen Weinheimer, who was a doctoral student in my laboratory at the time and is now a postdoc up at the University of Illinois at Chicago, Laura Sands, who's a geriatrician, also a biostatistician, and myself, we conducted a systematic review of literature looking at the independent and combined effects of diet-induced weight loss, exercise, and we focused specifically on fat-free mass in middle-aged and older adults. And to do this, it was a classic systematic review. We started off by identifying just under 2,000 articles, and of that we whittled it down to 52 that were of particular relevance to the issue. And our main outcome was very basic changes in body weight and changes in fat-free mass. We originally sought to also do skeletal muscle specifically, but we've realized from when we went into the literature that so few studies have actually directly measured muscle as opposed to lean tissue by things like DEXA or underwater weighing or bioelectric impedance or some other measurement, but very little information is specific to skeletal muscle by a technique like magnetic resonance imaging or the like. Well, that doesn't help. There we go. And these are the results that we found. Now, one of the other things that we measured, and I don't know how many of you may have had some experience with systematic reviews or meta-analyses, but unfortunately the literature is fraught with inadequacies because of the way that people typically report their data in the literature. And one of the measurements that is most helpful and needed for a meta-analysis is to actually know the change in something and the variability of that change. And often people will have a nice column with their baseline data, and they'll have a nice column with their post data and some statistics to show change. But what's really needed to do a meta-analysis is that third column that shows the change and the variability of the change. That's what can be used in a meta-analysis. What we were left with was really the need to do what's called a systematic review, which is a little weaker. We can't really do statistics on it. So what we were ending up doing is proportions of groups that had certain responses. And what our responses were that we were interested were changes in body weight of people that were energy restricting by diet only, and there were 36 different groups of participants from the various studies that fit that category, energy restriction plus exercise, again 36, or we also wanted to include energy restriction diet or exercise only without any dietary energy restriction. What we found as a proportion of groups is that most of the folks, and this is greater than or equal to 10 kilograms of weight loss, 5 to 10 kilograms, or less than 5 kilograms, so approaching weight stability. And you can see that the vast majority of the exercise groups exercise really wasn't effective in showing a large amount of weight loss. Most of the groups, both for diet and for exercise, lost somewhere between 5 and 10 kilos, and there was no apparent difference between the people with and without the exercise, and then you can see about 20% of the groups lost more than 10 kilos. This graph actually shows the shift in body composition responses associated with doing the exercise. So what we see here is the energy restriction. If people had not lost any weight, or excuse me, I'm sorry, this is fat-free mass. I got behind myself. This is the change in fat-free mass. If people had not lost any fat-free mass after while they were losing weight, their data point would come on this line. However, as you can see, the average was over here, and it shows that about 24% of their weight loss was fat-free mass. That's comparable to what the 25% that has been observed in other in similar types of analyses of weight loss studies in young people. To our knowledge, this is the first time that this type of information has been compiled in older individuals. We also noticed that if you then include exercise with the energy restriction, that the change in fat-free mass shifts to the right, such that the amount that's lost is only about 11% of the total weight loss. And so in essence, the inclusion of exercise allowed these middle-aged and older people to cut the amount of lean body mass that they were losing in half. And I can tell you, while there's not enough data, and I know it's very hard to see from back there, but there are a few right here, right here, right here, right here, right here. There's a few little triangles instead of squares. Those triangles are the studies that were specifically using strength training or resistance training. There was not enough data in the literature to be able to separate out for the purposes of the analysis whether or not between aerobic and resistance exercise. This conclusion on the preservation of lean tissue is really primarily focused on aerobic exercise, but it's interesting to note that actually all of the studies that did strength training had a complete preservation of the lean tissue, even though they were weight loss. Last thing I'd like to show you is this smallest to largest. We've actually, each one of these actually squares represents a different study. And what we looked at, this is the smallest amount of weight loss in a study, progressively up to the largest amount of weight loss. And the other thing that we observed that there was no difference. The magnitude of the weight loss did not influence the changes in body composition, which was surprising to us. We expected that people that lost the most weight the most rapidly would actually lose the most lean tissue, but that was not apparent from these studies. So what about, this just sort of summarizes what I just described, that with energy restriction alone, in young people and in older people, about 25% of your weight loss is lean tissue, whereas if you incorporate exercise, it's cut in half. The thing that hasn't been appreciated or factored into this, which I think is certainly something that needs to be done in future research, is that these older people have already experienced some degree of sarcopenia. And so we don't know whether or not the fat-free mass, this cutting in half, actually represents the same tissue or not. And from a functional standpoint, it may actually be very different as to whether or not this was cut in half for older people versus younger people. And we just don't have enough information yet to be able to confirm whether or not that's the case. So what about dietary protein? This is one example to show that dietary protein content of the diet does matter. And in this case, we have a group of men and a group of women. These are all older individuals from age 50 and older who participated in 12-week weight loss studies. And what we observed was, as was the case for the meta-analysis, that about 25% of what they lost as body weight was lean tissue. However, half of these participants consumed a high-protein diet, and half consumed about the RDA. This was about 175% of the RDA. And what we observed is that those that ate a high-protein diet, their loss of lean tissue was only about 20% of their total weight loss, whereas the people on the normal protein diet were actually losing about 30% of their weight loss as lean tissue. So dietary protein had an effect on the magnitude of the fat-free mass loss in people that were losing weight by energy restriction alone. Unfortunately, I don't have comparable data with the inclusion of exercise. The data from other studies, including Don Lehman and a few others, would suggest that the effects of dietary protein and the effects of exercise are independent of each other. They're not synergistic. So I would suggest that even if we did see an exercise effect to help preserve lean tissue, that would not negate the differential responses of the dietary protein. And one last point about this, and this is sort of just to tweak hopefully an interest. This was the study in our women looking at the effects of protein intake on changes in lean tissue mass with weight loss. We then retrospectively went in and we categorized our participants based on what was their body mass index status or weight status when they started the study. And so we found that we had a number of groups that were considered overweight, so their BMIs were between 25 and 30. And some of them were already started the study as clinically obese. Body mass indices, in this case, between 30 and 35. And so we had the effects of the high protein diet in red. We had the effects of the low protein diet. And as I showed you earlier, the main effect of protein was to have less weight loss in the red versus the blue. But interestingly, we found also that there was a main effect of obesity status or weight status as well. And that the women who had started the study in the overweight category, so the combination of the red and the solid bars against those that were already clinically obese, even though the quantity of weight lost was the same, the women that were already clinically obese were losing more lean tissue. And so the group that was at greatest risk for loss of lean tissue were women who started the study in the clinically obese group and consumed a lower protein diet. We've now since followed this up with a group of men and shown comparable results in men as well. So adds another factor of obesity status as well. So let's I know we're running out of time here. I want to put this all together. If we pull this together, we can certainly say that energy restriction is effective for weight loss, independent of protein intake. If you eat less than you need, you're going to lose weight. No one is recommending protein intakes below the RDA. The question is whether or not more is better and under what circumstances. Relative protein intake must be increased during energy restriction to maintain absolute intakes. I didn't really touch on that point earlier, but it makes sense that if people are if they just eat the same thing that you're eating but less of it, and you're a creature of habit, you're going to eat less protein if you just cut back on your portion size. So any counseling has to be to shift your intakes to maintain, or if not actually increase, total protein intake by counseling people to eat higher protein foods. Recommendations for protein intake vastly different than usual intakes, are not likely to be sustainable. And I leave this as an open question with respect to energy restriction. Preferred intakes are the appetite data, the thermogenesis data may suggest that protein's really not that big of a factor, but the body composition data certainly lends itself to being. I've put this list of potential issues just for your own consideration. We certainly need to determine protein needs of people during energy restriction. Most of the studies that are looking at protein needs do not consider the energy balance of people for requirement assessments. Most of the short-term studies, but long-term studies with phenotypic outcomes, including body compositions, are needed. And this is really important. We need to establish higher protein than what? When we do an experiment, what should our control group be? Should our control group be the RDA? Should the control group be the people what they normally consume and then eat more than that? Or something else, something within the acceptable macronutrient distribution? I'm sure that it would ultimately change based on this specific experiment, but this often is ignored in precisely defining it at the beginning of an experiment. We really need to know what are absolute and relative protein intakes with regard to normal, higher, and even higher. The literature, some people will say higher protein diets in their titles, and then when you look, they're only eating 10% more than the RDA. Some people will say that it's not really higher, but then all of a sudden they're feeding them 2 grams per kilo. And so there's really not a uniformity, and there's not really a standard for what these definitions are. Everybody's can be different. Certainly we need to consider improving experimental designs to evaluate protein quantity and predominant sources, various other factors that go into this, including the daily distribution of protein, and that's certainly something that many of you are keenly aware of. And I know I'm preaching to the choir in many respects, but we need to expand our dependent outcomes of interest to functional ones, not necessarily just static ones. And as you can see from this review, at least with respect to body composition and having a large enough literature to actually do systematic reviews, we're limited to fat-free mass at this point. We wanted to do it for glucose tolerance and high blood pressure and all those other types of things. There's just not enough literature to be able to do the systematic reviews with more than just a smattering of articles included. So more work is needed. And so I would not be able to do this work without an incredible research team and certainly a variety of funding sources. Dr. Kim is a new postdoc in my laboratory. Dr. Rosen has been my physician to help me for the last 7 or 8 years. Jan Green has been with me as a research associate for the last 11 years. These are a number of my doctoral students and my current undergraduate honors students. And with that, I will finish, and I appreciate your attention.
When you diet and you lose weight, the proportion of muscle that you lose. So we've been hearing a lot about that in research conferences and so forth. But the slide you put up showed a lot of that weight loss for lean mass as water. So if somebody loses 20 pounds of body weight, 5 pounds is lean mass. How much of that 5 pounds of lean mass that's lost is water?
Probably
versus
4
muscle?
pounds.
So maybe a kilogram or a pound of muscle on the whole?
No, the water would be potentially with muscle. It's just the hypertrophy of the cell. It still may be predominantly muscle, but you're losing size of the cells, and that's reflected by the loss of the water because you're really squeezing out from the cytosol mostly.
So it is, in your view, then, functional loss?
Functional loss is a tough one because I have not seen a systematic evaluation of the many water compartments of extracellular fluid, intracellular fluid, to really be able to partition what you're asking out. I've also I think that when I was talking with the graduate students earlier today, that I really think one of the places that we really need to start asking ourselves is what is the functional consequence of this apparent loss of lean tissue? And certainly with aging and sarcopenia and frailty and bed rest, those are much more dramatic, not only because the people are probably starting at a much frailer, closer to the threshold of where it's clinically relevant. For people that are losing weight, the studies that I have seen, and there are not many, it's very difficult to actually show any type of a functional consequence of the differential lean tissue mass loss. And the metabolic data don't support it, and the functional outcomes, the studies that have been done, as you can appreciate, often these studies are statistically powered for body comp changes, and then they tag on the functional outcomes as secondary analyses. Nobody has then, that I've seen in earnest, has gone back and then used those data to adequately power a functional consequence study, which would require a lot more subjects probably. Yes?
So for most of these studies where you're comparing a normal protein diet versus a higher protein diet, it's the carbohydrate that is adjusted and the fat is maintained as a percentage of the total energy.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think it is that they don't include a third group where they change the fat percentage and maintain carbohydrate? And what would you say to the assumption that it may be an effect of the carbohydrate being altered, which is affecting satiety or these other measures, rather than the protein being increased?
There are a number of studies that have also done fat changes, and I didn't present them today, but we've also done studies where we will shift the protein by changing a little bit of the carb and a little bit of the fat, so that we keep the non-protein carbohydrate to fat ratio in the diet consistent. So you're darned if you do, and you're darned if you do, and experimentally. The reason that most of them do the carbohydrate is either that one is because carbohydrate and protein are energetically interchangeable on a gram per gram basis reasonably well, and that many of the folks are considering the carbohydrate to be one of the culprits in the sort of the obesity epidemic and simple sugars and just sort of that myriad of descriptors. I personally don't think that it would matter with respect to weight loss. I think the real difference in weight loss is really a reflection of how tight you are with your diet control. We actually observe with our studies where we do normal versus high protein diets that the preservation of the lean tissue actually results in our subjects that are on the high protein diet losing less weight than the normal protein group. Calorie for calorie, we're looking at the same, we're much tighter. I think that the excess weight loss that is often shown is a reflection of just total calorie intake, and that they've got differences, whether or not it's satiety, whether or not it's just cheating and compliance, or some other issue. I wish I knew. I think it probably varies from study to study. The impact on weight loss of whether or not you're getting your calories from protein, carb, and fat, I think in tightly controlled conditions, calorie for calorie, it's probably not as different as the body of literature would suggest it would be.
So I mean, following on from that, if you're saying that it's reducing the carbohydrate and increasing the protein, part of why you're reducing the carbohydrate is that's seen as being metabolically advantageous. If you just increase the fat relative to carbohydrate, may that also have a similar benefit to increasing the protein?
No, that's absolutely true. I think one of the things that I always keep in mind when I'm designing these types of diets is even if you're changing one macronutrient versus another compared to protein, because protein is the least consumed macronutrient among the three in a typical diet, 15-16% of calories versus maybe 50% for carbs and 30% for fats, that any relative change in protein is going to be much more dramatic than it is for the carbs and the fat. So you may gram for gram shift carbohydrate and protein, but as a percentage of what you typically consume, you may be doubling protein and only changing carbohydrate by maybe 10 or 15%. So the change in substrate availability to the tissue is much more dramatic for protein than it is for the other two macronutrients.
I was struck by the differences in protein intake you see throughout the course of a day. Can you comment on how, for lack of a better word, how natural that is? I mean, it looks remarkably preserved from younger to older age. Is that seen in other cultures? I mean, it appeared that you would have that you were more sensitive to being sated in the morning than in the evening, to the extent that those differences were driven by your level of satiety, limiting your intake with each meal.
I honestly haven't looked culture to culture. My sort of naive perception is that it would vary from culture to culture based on what their typical food. I mean, if I go to Scandinavian countries with their breakfast of cheese and meats, I'm sure it's a little different than it is here in the States with our Cheerios and Pop-Tarts. As far as you've asked if I'm correct in hearing you, you asked a very important and interesting question about the diurnal changes in appetite in relation to macronutrients. And we honestly don't know, as far as what I can tell, is whether or not in vivo it makes a difference. Our data from those the meals across the day would suggest that two things. One is that, at least in our laboratory experiments, that we were able to repeatedly because they were eating exactly the same food 3 times or 6 times. We were getting reproducible appetitive responses that did not have an appreciable carryover. And other studies have shown a carryover. Some people, when they do those experiments, they look for changes in ingestive behaviors, but usually they don't make those measurements long enough, a day or 2 or 3 or more, to really see whether or not there's a full compensation for those calorie changes in the short term. Dr. Blundell and Dr. King and others that are really into the appetitive responses to different foods, and in particular in exercise as well, describe the appetitive, if you'll use the term appetitive for fluids, that the thirst responses are very tightly coupled. You're at risk for dehydration, you're going to drink. It's not as tightly coupled for food. Most of these types of experiments are just too short to show this. That's why, at least in my, and I fall prey to the same thing in my lab if somebody's looking for this, but I would rather see the field itself move toward more chronic outcomes when you're and using appetite as a secondary measure, not as a primary measure in determining the effectiveness or efficacy of a food product. But it's easy to market satiety.
Sure. All right.
Hey, thank you very much. Appreciate it.